Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 7th International Conference on the Development and Assessment of Intercultural Competence. I am Beatrice Dupuig, and I co-direct Circle with my colleague Chantal Warner, who's sitting here in the front. I'm excited to see the many familiar faces of those who have attended this conference before, but also many new faces. Thank you for joining us. But I'd like to start with acknowledgement and thank yous. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which we gather today, both the University of Arizona and this beautiful resort where we are standing sit on the original homelands of indigenous peoples from the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui nations, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Let's take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the ongoing dedication and importance of indigenous culture within our communities and within the land where we gather, live, learn, and work on. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our many co-sponsors at the University of Arizona and beyond, and whose support makes this conference possible. Finally, although this information has already been broadly disseminated, I would like to remind you that the best way to locate all relevant information about this conference is on the app featured on this slide, and which you can download on your phone. The app allows you to check out the profile of attendees, network, exchange contact information for future collaborations, get updated information from the organizers on the various talks that will be taking place for the next few days, find out about transportation, dining options, and places to discover nearby, etc. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first plenary speaker, Dr. Sharon Stein. Dr. Stein is assistant professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia in Canada and serves as convener of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network. Her scholarship brings critical perspectives to the role of higher education in society, especially as this relates to internationalization, decolonization, and environmental sustainability. Her work in the area of international education emphasizes the educational challenges of addressing the interrelated ecological, cognitive, affective, relational, and economic dimensions of global interdependence. By identifying the limits of dominant imaginaries of justice, responsibility, and change, she seeks to both gesture towards different possible futures and work with and through the joys and challenges of collective transformation. Her talk this evening is entitled Internationalization and the Educational Challenges of Imagining Alternative Global Futures. Please help me give Dr. Stein a warm welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I am Dr. Sharon Stein, and I realize my title is kind of a mouthful, so my apologies about that. I want to also start with acknowledgements and thank yous. First and foremost to the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui peoples. I want to acknowledge that this was and is their territory, and to bring attention to the fact that we are able to be here through ongoing violence. And I think we need to think about what that means in relation to internationalization more than we often do. I also want to thank the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy for inviting me. I want to thank the Critical Internationalization Studies Network, many members of whom I think are here, which is amazing, for helping me think through a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today. Also the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, of which I'm a part, and the In-Earth's Care Network that I'll talk a bit about in my talk, and the various movements for global and social justice that have also informed the way I think about what I'm going to talk about today. So, broadly speaking, one of my areas of study is critical internationalization studies, and I'm going to talk about what that means today. Before I do that, I think we have to kind of start with just internationalization itself, which, as you probably all know by now, Jane Knight's famous definition, but also the ways that it has been deemed instrumental for preparing globally engaged students, producing relevant knowledge, and generating solutions for today's global challenges. And in many ways, internationalization is framed in our institutions as this inevitable thing that just has to happen because the world is global, which has many things to recommend it, but we also identify this sort of imperative to internationalize, and then it becomes, how do we do this more, as opposed to questions about why are we actually undertaking this venture and what are the ethical and political implications of this work. So that's where critical internationalization studies comes in. Essentially, it brings critical perspectives to voice concerns about the risks of reproducing uneven global power relations, representations, and resource flows, problematize and complicate this overwhelmingly positive and often depoliticized nature of the mainstream approaches to internationalization, especially in westernized institutions, and also to put forth other possibilities for how we can have international engagements and forms of knowledge production that don't reproduce these same colonial patterns. So 6 years ago now, Hans de Wit made this very useful statement about the need to kind of rethink internationalization and where we were going. So he said, internationalization in higher education is at a turning point, and the concept of internationalization requires an update, refreshment, and fine-tuning, taking into account the new world and higher education order. And I think him saying this really, makes people listen, because he has such a big name. And I think it really marked a turning point in this critical approach, because these big names were saying, like, listen, we need to rethink what we're doing here. So 6 years later, what I'm suggesting is, okay, great, we've got this critical conversation going, but we also need to rethink how we are doing critique. There's many different ways of engaging critique. It has different implications. So we need to, yes, take into account the recent changes, but also the ways that even in our critical conversations, a lot of these colonial patterns continue to be reproduced, and there might even be limits to critique itself. So if we think about the present state of critical internationalization studies, we see, first of all, as evidenced by Hans de Wit's statement, that there's sort of a mainstreaming of the critique. So not only are these big names talking about it more, but we can see it even in our institutional policies. My university just created their new international strategic plan, and in it there is a recognition of the colonial past, and I made sure they said present too, of the university. But of course, there's also the paradox of this institutionalization as well, because these can become very quickly sort of non-performative statements. Yes, they acknowledge their colonial actions, but they don't really make any substantive commitments to redress them or think about what this might mean going forward. It's there, and it can be used in a strategic way, which is very useful, but there might be limits to this institutionalization as well. We see, despite all of our best efforts, the continued prioritization of financial over ethical and political concerns in our institutions, and I think a lot of us are sort of wrapped up in that as well as we think about the students that we're recruiting to our institutions. So we might be critical of it, but we're also sort of dependent on it for our living. And then, as I've already started to emphasize, the continued invisibility of colonial imaginaries that encompass both the mainstream and many critical approaches as well. So this is kind of where I think we're at and what we need to address. So one thing that I discovered early on when I was talking to people with this critical approach is that actually the critical approach is this huge umbrella for many different perspectives. And sometimes when people see this range of perspectives, they want to narrow it down and say, we need to come to a consensus about what this critical approach really means. But actually, if we think about the world itself and its complexity, uncertainty, and difference, then we actually have to learn to work with that complexity, uncertainty, and difference, and why not start with our conversation? So what I really have tried to do in my work as well is think about how we can have these conversations across different perspectives to understand what are the different ethical and political frameworks that people are working with, and how do these different frameworks lead us to characterize the problem itself differently, as well as characterize our proposed responses to the problem differently, and what did each of these offer, and rather than it being a competition for the hegemonic position of criticality. So, one of the ways I do this is through social cartography. So social cartographies are essentially maps of multiple ways of framing a shared problem of concern. So the intention is to enable those who engage the maps to trace the implicit and political theoretical investments and assumptions about each of the different approaches that are there, to better understand the relationships between them and the possibilities and limitations that each offers. So it's not supposed to be a universal God's eye view map. You always acknowledge as the mapper where you're coming from so that the people engaging it understand. But it's not about agreeing or disagreeing, it's asking where can this map bring our conversation that we haven't thought about before. So everything is always provisional and partial and open to being remapped. And it reminds us to have humility in the way that we conceptualize knowledge and knowledge production. So I'm going to present a few cartographies here. And they can be in many different forms, but the first one I'm going to show is actually a visual. And this is called the House Modernity Built, and it's an effort to kind of capture the primary dimensions of the modern world. And you can see you have the foundation of separability of humans from nature, of humans from each other, and all these hierarchies that then follow. You can see the carrying wall of universal reason, just one rationality that leads us toward progress, the nation state, which promises security, and then global capital, which provides the means of this continuous accumulation. And you can see that the house rests on this planet, and it's exceeding the boundaries of that planet. So in order to kind of make sense of the house, you have to think about also its underside. So there's a colonial underside of the house modernity built, these hidden costs. And you can see that the house itself is sustained through expropriation and then produces waste that it then flushes out of itself, and it requires destitution, dispossession, and genocide to exist. So one way of also visualizing this, if people are not sort of visual, is a nice handy chart that talks about the different modern promises that the house offers, and then the colonial process that subsidized that promise. So for instance, this foundation of separation promises independence and autonomy, but the cost of that is that we deny our interdependence with each other and our responsibilities to one another and to other than human beings. Or the capitalist economic system, which promises continuous growth and accumulation, but the cost of that is exploitation and expropriation of human beings and other than human beings as well. So this is another cartography, another way of showing the things in the map that I think is important for us to think about as we're thinking about how we do internationalization differently. So if we think about the fact that the house itself is unsustainable, and not only ecologically unsustainable, but economically unsustainable, politically unsustainable, as we think about the crises that we're facing, we are facing a new moment, and the question that we have to ask is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to patch up the house, just fix the walls a little bit and keep on going? Are we going to fence the walls, as we already are doing in the US and elsewhere? So that less people can come in? Are we going to expand it, maybe add on a few rooms for those people that want to come in, but continue the house as it is? Or perhaps we should replace the house. Or maybe we need to find a whole other planet. So these are all different responses that we've seen people have to the crises that we face today. So I identify 5 key challenges of this house in crisis. There is the systemic, historical, and ongoing colonial violence that underwrites the maintenance of the house and the socioeconomic system, which is premised on this invisibilized exploitation and expropriation. There's its inherent unsustainability of a system premised on infinite growth on a finite planet. Then there's the emergence of multiple unprecedented, complex, wicked problems, including polarization, extreme weather, labor precarity, mass migration, the cancellation of civil, human, and labor rights, and a global mental health crisis. So these are all rooted in these first 2 challenges that have a longer history, but they're kind of intensifying and coming to a head right now. Then we have the intellectual and affective difficulties of imagining otherwise when we're faced with all of these problems, right? And part of this is because we don't necessarily have the stamina for the kind of difficult conversations that we need to have in order to face this growing storm. And then finally, overcoming the denial and the depth and the magnitude of the wicked problems we face. We still have people looking for simple solutions. If we just did this, if we just disinvested, if we just developed this green technology, we could fix it. But maybe it's much, much bigger than that. And we have to figure out how to have the stamina and the strength to actually face the storm instead of turning away from it. So what kind of internationalization would be adequate to the task of preparing us to respond generatively to today's numerous overlapping crises? So I reviewed some of the different responses to the housing crisis, but here's a simplified version, maybe simplified, not sure, but 3 different possibilities. So the first theory of change about how we should address this house or how should we address these crises is what I would call minor reform. We're helping to make the existing world more equitable. So if we're thinking about the house, that's where maybe you add a room onto the house because you know that there are more people that are coming from places that have nowhere else to go. But you still have hope in the continuity and expansion and improvement of the existing global system. So the internationalization that kind of aligns with this, I would say, is internationalization for global public good. And usually these are sort of liberal theories in terms of the theoretical frameworks. So once you kind of move on and say, okay, well actually there's something wrong with this minor reform because it doesn't actually incorporate other ways of knowing. Yeah, it expands the house, but everything about the house is still the same. So another possibility is major reform. And this is changing the world based on the knowledges and the leadership of oppressed people. So where we're modeling the house, using the knowledges, using the leadership of people who have either been excluded from the house or maybe relegated to its lower floors. So you hope for radically remaking the unequal global system that we have. And I would say this is internationalization for global solidarity. And these are more critical theories, whether that's feminist or critical race theory or post-colonial theory, other theories that we might draw on to think about how we can radically remake this house because we know it's not sustainable anymore. And then we see, okay, so it's not maybe just about dominant ways of knowing, but actually dominant ways of being that we need to rethink, which then leads to the beyond reform theory of change. So the idea is that this house is coming down, whether we like it or not, and we need to prepare for new worlds without over-determining what they might look like. So yes, we might need to live elsewhere, but it's not about having a preset blueprint about what that's gonna look like. And part of it is about learning from the mistakes of the house so that we realize how we got here, and then the next thing that we try, we don't make the same mistakes. Yes, we're gonna make new mistakes. That's gonna happen no matter what. But we don't wanna make the same mistakes because we've already gone through this once. So this is what I call internationalization otherwise, that I would say is informed by decolonial theories, but I don't think decolonial theories provide a prescription for what this could look like. They show the problems with the other possibilities and gesture towards something else. And I think if we suggest that they tell us what to do, then we're not actually honoring what the critique itself offers. So I'll just pause for a minute to ask you to think about what internationalization would look and feel like in each of these theories of change, the minor reform, the major reform, and the beyond reform. Where do your own ways of thinking and practicing internationalization and those of your institution, whatever it might be, fall in these 3 theories? Where would you like them to be, and what might be some of the barriers to moving there? So I'll just give you a minute or 2 to mull that over. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you, no, not tell you what they all look like, but I will show some questions that might be asked in each of these spaces in regards to international students, internationalizing the curriculum, and study abroad. Okay, so I also have these on the worksheet, so I don't know that I'm going to read every single question because that might take a long time, but for a minor reform approach to international students, international student recruitment, a question might be, how can we ensure that international students, their host countries, and their home countries benefit from their experience abroad? How can we foster positive engagements between international and domestic students? How can we prepare more culturally competent staff? It's a very relevant question for this conference. A major reform, how can we recruit a more globally representative student body? What promises do Western institutions offer international students, and how do these compare to the benefits that they actually receive? How can we address racism across the institution, from admissions to curriculum to evaluation? And then for beyond reform, What economic and geopolitical histories have made the West a desired location for international study? How might we denaturalize the presumed superiority of Western education? How can we understand international students as complex persons with conflicting desires, as we all are, who might be both subject to marginalization as well as complicit in others' marginalization? And one of the things to keep in mind with cartographies like this is that they're not supposed to be mutually exclusive. Like, you pick one and you identify with it, and that's what you do and what you say at all times. In any given day, I think I draw on all of these depending on the context I'm in and what is possible. So when I'm in the meeting for developing the strategic plan for UBC, the beyond reform makes no sense. So I might offhandedly say something about it, but what I'm really working is trying to bring probably minor reform people to consider the major reform questions, and then gesture to the fact that there's even more to consider, but we're probably not going to get to that place with this institutional document. So thinking about what each of these offer, and it really depends on your context. And part of the gift of the cartographies is that you can kind of see what each offers, and depending on the context, then mobilize what's useful. So, internationalizing the curricula. A minor reform question might be, how can all disciplines incorporate international dimension to their programs? Major reform question. How can we ensure that diverse knowledges are not just included, but actually valued and rewarded in our institutions? And what is needed to build the institutional capacity for teaching and research outside Western knowledge? And we know that bringing in one or two people or one or two students does not cut it, and then they get totally overburdened, and it's usually a form of conditional inclusion, right? So what can we do to go beyond that so that it's actually structurally changing our institution? From a beyond reform perspective, it's not just about bringing knowledges in, but also changing our approach to knowledge itself. So rather than seeking absolute truth and replacing the Western truth with some other truth, it's actually about thinking about, well, how is knowledge contextual and contextually relevant? And that's what we're trying to get at, to understand that each knowledge system has gifts and also has ignorances within it. And then finally, international service learning. How can service abroad inspire students to become leaders with a sense of global responsibility? This is a minor reform question. Major reform question might be, what uneven structures enable certain students to travel and not others? How does the service relation risk reproducing saviorism and inequity? And it's great that more and more people are asking these questions from what I can tell. Beyond reform approach might be, how can visiting students actually learn to listen to the needs, desires, and dreams of host communities? And it is a process of learning to listen, because they might be saying all these things already, the community, but are students actually prepared to go in with the humility to know that, okay, this is an entirely different way of knowing and being, and I might not know what I'm doing, and that's okay. But you have to prepare them for that. It's not just about saying you need to listen to the community, it's a whole process of sort of undoing the idea of Western supremacy. So those are some questions, some cartographies about internationalization. If you're interested in having these conversations about what critical internationalization studies is and could be, I encourage you to check out the network and even join. It does bring together scholars, practitioners, educators, students, and community organizations who are trying to reimagine the dominant patterns of relationship, representation, and resource distribution in internationalization. And there are people from each of these theories of change and more, and we all figure out a way to get along and have difficult conversations without the relationships falling apart. So that's something to check out if you're interested. What I'm going to do for the rest of my time is focus in depth on the beyond reform approach, in part because in addition to mapping the different approaches, I also engage with this one in more depth, and also just because it is sort of the least visible in our institutions, and I think it's worth spending a bit of time on that. So I came to this approach through recognition that there are these common circularities of neoliberal, liberal, and many critical approaches to internationalization. So I thought there must be something else out there. And in particular, despite the fact that these different approaches have different intellectual genealogies and political commitments, they all tended to be oriented by the same colonial assumptions and entitlements. So what the beyond reform or internationalization otherwise approach really tries to do is figure out how we can invite learners to decenter themselves, to deepen their sense of responsibility, and to disinvest from harmful desires so that we can learn to coexist differently on a shared finite planet. So I've been talking about these colonial circularities, so I must say a bit more about them, I think. These are some common circularities that happen in our efforts to make global and social change. And they're in a nice little acronym. The first one is continuity of the existing system and its promises. We're willing to reform it up to a point. We're willing to give up something up to a point, but we still want the thing to keep going. We still want that house because we would be lost without it, right? Innocence from complicity and harm. So we want to say, I recognize the problem and I'm not part of it anymore, or I'm gonna do something to get myself out of it. When actually, complicity in the system, it's structural. It's not something we can just opt out of, which doesn't mean we should do nothing. We have to take responsibility, but how can we work with complicity as a starting point and stay with it as we proceed and remain accountable for those things? There's also this tendency to recenter the self or the majority group nation in our actions. So even when we think about, for instance, some of the responses to the travel ban, a lot of it was, well, this is going to hurt American competitiveness and it's going to be bad for our national reputation. And the students themselves get lost and the larger geopolitical picture gets lost. There's also this desire for certainty of outcomes and guaranteed solutions. And if you don't offer this, people don't want to listen. So one of the ways I frame my work now is, if not this, then what? It's always the question that people come to after my talks, and they want me to tell them what to do, and I can't. I can help us think through ways of working with that uncertainty in generative ways and thinking about some of the traps that we often fall in, but I think we're facing this unprecedented storm, and there's a lot of unknowns, and we're just gonna have to be okay working with that, which doesn't mean we don't try things, but that when we try them, we recognize that they might not be it, they might create their own problems. Then there is a desire for unrestricted autonomy. So again, that space of, well, I want to be committed to this project, but only up to this point where it doesn't impinge on my free time. Or I'm willing to advocate for social justice, but if I see a racialized person coming from my spot at the university, that's when my social justice goes away. So how can we get out of this sense of always it being a calculation of when we want to be responsible and when we don't? And part of that is giving up this unrestricted autonomy. Then there is this desire for leadership. And if it's not leadership of the person speaking, of the Western subject, then it's, okay, then the oppressed will lead us. So if it's not Greta leading us out of climate change, then we say, okay, but there's this indigenous young person who's gonna do it. And yes, these leaders are important, but no one person has the answers. So how are we gonna work collectively to figure this mess out? The authority to arbitrate justice. So we understand that there are problems in the world, yes, but we want to decide who we listen to, which critiques we like and which we don't, and then we just selectively engage and even instrumentalize them as it is convenient for us. And then finally, we want recognition for our righteousness, and we want redemption for being good. We made all these critiques, do we get a cookie? And there's no cookies. This is just the work. So how can we be sustained in this work and be responsible and be accountable without looking for affirmation for what we're doing? We just do it because that's what needs to be done. And for this larger metabolism that we're working at, that's where we find ourselves, and that's what we can do. So it's really hard to get out of all these circularities. I think we can all recognize these in ourselves in one moment or another. So this is not like, if you do this, you're bad. It's just about starting to notice when these things happen. And it's really hard to challenge them all at once. And if you try to do that, you'll probably become totally unintelligible to anyone, which is, I think, why some knowledge systems and ways of being are actually unintelligible to Western socialized people, because they are different ways of being in the world, and it doesn't relate, so then we try to graft back into our system their knowledges. The other thing is that when these colonial entitlements arise and they're challenged, this is when the intellectual critique and the affective response tend to diverge. So we might know all of these problems. We might understand the history of colonialism, but when someone actually says, but you're reproducing that pattern, it's like, no, I'm not doing it. Like, I'm a good person. So how do we understand that this work is intellectual? Yes, but it's also affective. How do we have a different response and show up differently to this work with humility, with compassion, with generosity? And that's not something that you're going to find in a book, probably. So what is that other work that needs to be done? How can we, again, invite people to identify and interrupt these colonial entitlements in themselves and others, trace what makes these entitlements possible? How are we even able to continue doing this? What kind of a system is set up that allows certain people to keep doing this? And how can we start to disinvest from the entitlements? So it's not saying, I'm not going to do it anymore because it's not probably realistic, but how can we try to start to do that work so that other possibilities start to become viable? So, again, I don't think internationalization otherwise is a different way of doing internationalization, like this prescriptive thing. It's a different way of approaching the work. It's an orientation towards something else. And the communities that I work with as part of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective and the In-Earth's Care Network are already doing things outside of the house or that challenge the house because they haven't had access to the house or the house was built on their backs. So they offer examples, not models, but examples of how we might gesture beyond modern forms of social economy. So that's capitalism, but also socialism. Nation states as the basis of our politics and our relationships. The separation between man and nature, so anthropocentrism, but also patriarchy, and then this idea of separability of ourselves from one another and the earth. The single universal knowledge system. Social mobility as the purpose of life, which I think is actually a big thing in internationalization, and sometimes I think the edge of our critique. It's like, how can we get more people to be socially mobile? But if we think about this finite planet, there's not an infinite global social middle class. So how else can we imagine possibilities for living together on the planet? And then consumption of goods, knowledges, relationships, and experiences as the primary mode of relating to the world. So it's not just that we consume things, we also consume people and ideas, and we instrumentalize them toward what we want. How can we encounter the world on its own terms and other people on their own terms, and actually be surprised by them instead of projecting outward? So, although there's no prescription for what this looks like, as part of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective and the In-Earth's Care Network, we have come up with a framework for helping us think about how we do this work differently. And the idea here is to integrate different dimensions of justice, or we might say dimensions of well-being. So it's ecological, cognitive, affective, relational, and ecological. And you can see that there's a reason why there's mushrooms and then mycelium. So often we see the clear problems in the ecological dimension or in the economic dimensions. That's where for many people, especially again, people socialized in a Western system, where it's most evident. What we don't often think about is the mycelium below the earth that enable the mushrooms to grow. And that's the way we orient ourselves cognitively, affectively, and relationally. So if we want to grow different mushrooms to have different ecological relationships and different economic and political systems, then we need to think about growing differently from underground. So how do we shift and recalibrate this cognitive, affective, and relational work? So for ecological justice, this would be reframing the environment from a set of resources to be extracted towards actually living things, rather and not property to be owned. For cognitive justice, emphasizing the need to interrupt a monoculture of thought based on a single rationality, and also again this idea of recognizing the possibilities and limitations of all knowledge systems. For affective justice, emphasizing the need to work through these unevenly distributed traumas, fragilities, and fears that have been generated within the existing system, and learn to be comfortable with difficulty, complexity, uncertainty, conflict, complicity, failure, and disillusionment in the work of transformation, because it's sort of inevitable. For relational justice, how do we develop reciprocal rather than extractive or consumptive relationships with, with each other and the earth? And finally, for economic justice, how do we enact modes of coordination and collaboration that support collective well-being in ways that go beyond just this idea of distribution of resources, because we need to think about resources themselves differently. Again, this idea of not consuming everything. So I think that's on your handout if you want to learn more. This is where my Mac user is really biting me in the butt. So I'm not going to go through all these because you have the worksheet, but I do think if we think about these different justices and forms of well-being, we can see that they really gesture towards a totally different approach to internationalization. And we can think through each of these. I think I won't read them all. You've probably seen enough text. But if you want to learn more, the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures website is there, and then the In-Earth Care Network. And for the collective, essentially it's a working space for researchers, artists, educators, students, activists to engage research, and that's not just the traditional academic research, but also artistic and pedagogical research. And then the collective works with the cluster of communities that make up the In-Earth Care Network, which are indigenous communities in Brazil, Peru, and Mexico, and that are focused on experiential land-based learning. And we propose analyses and pedagogies that try to enable healthier possibilities for coexistence that are viable but generally unthinkable from within our dominant cognitive, affective, and relational mycelium. And I think one question that we often get is, how do you want to scale this up? But that's not the idea. This is an experiment, so we don't say we have any answers. We're just trying things and learning and failing, and we're interested if you have ideas you want to bring to it as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to take about 10 minutes. If anybody has questions for Dr. Stein, feel free to raise your hand and I can come to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stein. I have a clarifying question. When you were on the circularities slide, it's continuity, innocence, recentering, etc.
Yes.
The recentering one is the one that I'm wondering if I understand correctly. So is it or is it not an example? Let's say at my university, University of Hawaii, we've recently adopted, say, an institutional mission statement that acknowledges that we're on Hawaiian land, and the university is a guest, and so forth. So thereby the university, sort of subsumes the protest, as it were. Is that what you mean by recentering? That the institution redefines itself to sort of swallow the problem? Or can you explain a little bit more? So.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing example. I guess when I was making the list, I was thinking more about individuals, but it definitely happens with institutions, and I think that's a perfect example of how it's a way to sort of contain the protest and prevent further things from happening, although it doesn't actually, but it appeases. Or you can also see even universities in the US now, like they talk about the history of civil rights on campus, so then they co-opt these like protests that students did against the university, but like somehow become part of their system. It always justifies the existence of the university yet again. So I think that's an amazing example. Thank you. Yes, or the individual recentering, which also happens, institutional and individual.
Hello, Dr. Stein. Thank you very much for the presentation, really inspiring. And I was wondering if you can comment a little bit more on the cartographies. You mentioned that it's obviously not something that you can choose to be in one or the other, but understanding and acknowledging our institutions as these huge elephants that move very slowly, and we know that it's unsustainable to keep doing internationalization the way we're doing it. Do you see that like as an evolutionary process, that we need to move from minor reform to major reform, then to start thinking about beyond, or should we just start kind of forget about patching the house and we need to start thinking directly how to move beyond that from the institutional level?
Great question. I mean, I think the short answer is we need people doing everything. Like, we need people in all of those spots. We need people fighting at the institutional level. I definitely do that work. But we also need people experimenting with other things outside, and we need to be in conversation more about these different possibilities. I think normalizing, like the beyond reform especially, and I think as the crisis intensifies, this storm intensifies, it becomes harder and harder to deny, although we still do it. And in many ways, it's hard to do our jobs if we don't have some level of denial. But that's where the work of disinvestment becomes useful, for me anyway. So again, and I can't remember who we got this from initially, but the distinction between divestment and disinvestment. Divestment being you remove yourself from the place, or you remove the resources if we're talking about investments, but if we're thinking about individuals, some people get so disillusioned with the university that they want to just leave. And that's, of course, also an option. But divestment is more about not investing in the futurity of the institution, but also not leaving preemptively. So figuring out, well, what, as long as I'm here, can I do and can I try? How can I push them to think about these other things? But I don't get disappointed when they don't do it, because all of my intellectual analyses tells me that this is exactly what they're going to keep doing. So part of it's, in these institutions, I think, reducing harm, which might be then working in the minor reform space. But I think as we are spaces of thinking, how do we, again, naturalize and open up these other possibilities for people, even if they aren't possible right now, to know that there are other possibilities that people have kept alive despite the House trying to suppress them. And it's not that they have the answers for what we need to do, but what can they teach us, and how can we be inspired and revere them without romanticizing them?
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you. I also found this very inspiring, and I'm sure we all did, that it's really exciting to think in these new ways and try to act in these new ways. Can you give us just a little bit of an example of what you're doing in, I think you said Brazil, Peru, and Mexico? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that work it's very emergent. I mean, the issue, like, and this is an issue of internationalization especially, but also the institutional structure, and I think it's actually internationalization and indigenization, is that when you're working with certain communities especially, these processes are emergent. So you can't go to the IRB and say, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm going to ask, here's what I'm going to learn. So a lot of the work we do now it's really about learning at the interface of these two different knowledge systems, and what are how can we map the patterns in ourselves for what happens when we have these encounters. Often people want like an ethnography or something, and that's not really the point, because that tends to reify culture and reproduce this objectification again. So part of what we're actually trying to figure out is, how do we frame this work for people? And we do actually bring them to UBC, which is amazing, because it totally interrupts. Like, we invited someone that we work with in Peru, Maria Jara, to our, we had a faculty lunch, and then we asked if she could stay for the faculty meeting. And she stayed and listened, and then she gave her thoughts, like, here's, from a Quechua perspective, what you're doing, and maybe what you should think about. Not everyone appreciated it. In fact, I had a colleague say that it was new age. So you definitely get the pushback, but I think in terms of, there are cracks in our institutions, so how can we mobilize those cracks and actually mobilize resources to communities that actually need them? I know this is being filmed, so I shouldn't say too much, but how can we redirect and use these resources in ways that don't just further our career, but actually enable these projects to continue, enable their knowledge production to continue in those spaces as well.
Okay, another question.
Hi, thank you. I wonder what you might say about the ways that internationalization efforts in universities are becoming aggregated under large, entities, maybe underneath the provost or really high up, where you have the combination of people who are interested in the issues that you raise here, put together with people who are embarking on major international policy or economic or tech or business ventures with China and India and other places, and suddenly everyone gets swept along in a tide. Where are the places where these sorts of ideas flourish, and where are they needed most? And perhaps those are completely opposite places.
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is, depending on your context, mapping what is happening, who the people are, what the cartography of your institution is, and what is possible in each of those spaces. So again, like, what's possible in the strategic plan working group is very limited, but we still need to have someone in the room, and you're not going to push them to beyond reform. Like, there's no way there would be an institutional strategic plan that's beyond reform. I don't even know what it would look like. But you want someone who's thinking that way as part of the working group, because they will push. They're not going to push them all the way, but their presence will potentially allow something else to happen. And you don't always know what it's going to be. That's the thing. So I think looking at all of these things as opportunities, and sometimes I think, I will speak for myself, you do get like sort of disgusted by the corporate mode of it, and you can't always be in that space. But actually, sometimes there are cracks there, especially because sometimes people they're more aware than we think, and they just need someone to say it. And maybe they can't say it, especially if they're in a leadership role. But if I, as the faculty member, come in theoretically with academic freedom and say it, then that might actually be helpful for them. Or they might resent you. It could go either way, but